Some other examples of police power that we're going to be looking at. One here is building codes. Obviously, this is another example of public controls, things the government has to say about it. But there are building codes if you're going to be constructing or building a building, right? You can't just start nailing boards together. They have to meet code. One way we make sure that buildings are built to code is you have to have a permit, and with the permit, there are a few things you need to understand, at least for test purposes, for sure, about permits. But if you wanted to build a shed or a building, shop, whatever, say in your backyard, then you have to have a building permit. The building department at your municipality, they would issue these permits. But when you submit your application for the permit, you obviously got to explain exactly what you're going to do, and they will typically require you to indicate exactly, like to the feet, how many feet from the property line will the building be, the size, so all the details about what you want to do, you got to submit in your application. So, what's the purpose of the permit? At least for us as real estate agents, this is a big deal. Because we know if the homeowner or property owner got a permit to do whatever they did or doing, we know two things. One, that they're allowed to have whatever it is they're proposing to have. If it's a building, a shed, shop, whatever, we know they're allowed to have it. And I will tell you, when you submit your permit to do it, as long as there's no regulation or zoning ordinance or something that would prevent you from having it, then they would approve the permit, right? So we know if you got a permit, number one, you're allowed to have whatever it is that's here. The other major component of this is, once they issue the permit, they will tell you, now you can go ahead and begin construction or work on whatever it is you're trying to do. But then they'll say, once you reach a certain point, you need to stop. Do not go beyond this point. You need to stop, call us, let us know, and then they'll send their building inspector out to inspect exactly what you've done up to that point. And assuming you've done everything to code, it's done properly, then they'll say, all right, well, now you can go ahead and start working some more. But then once you get to this point, you need to stop again, call us, let us come out. And they'll do this all the way through this process. So now, the second thing we now know as a real estate agent, assuming they got the permit, is safe. It's built properly. It's not going to hurt somebody. Nobody's going to get electrocuted, stuff like that. So that's two very important things we need to understand and know. Now, if you're the agent, you're listing a house for sale, or getting ready to list a house for sale, and you see where they've got a building of some sort in their backyard, based on what we just talked about, what should the homeowner have already, what should they have already gotten? A permit. So, I would ask them, hey, love the shed, love the shop, whatever it is. It looks nice. Sure, any buyer would love to have it, but just curious, did you get a permit before you built this building back here? And I will tell you, a lot of times they'll just say no, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. In fact, I'll tell you most of the time the answer is probably no. But let's say they say, yes, we did. As the agent, you have a duty to verify this information. It's unfortunate, but you just can't take people at their word all the time. That is very unfortunate. But I've just learned in my real estate career, I pretty much have a slogan I go by now. In God we trust. All else we verify. Because I've just been told so many things over the years, and that just turns out not to be true. So you don't want to get in trouble by telling somebody, a potential buyer, yes, there were permits for this, and then find out later there were no permits. You can pull permits, okay? And if it were me, in fact, I do. I always contact the building department and get a copy of the permit that was issued, so to construct whatever building or whatever they've done back here. Then that way I know it's verified. You can't come against me for saying something that's not true now. But with the permit, we now know, again, it's safe and you're allowed to have it here. If they didn't get a permit, I don't know the answer to either one of those questions. I don't know if, number one, you're even allowed to have it, and I certainly don't know if it's safe. So we need to know that. So if we find out there was no permit, you can still list the property, you can still sell the property, but as an agent, you have to disclose that to potential buyers. There is a shop, there's a shed, whatever it is back here, but there was no permit pulled at the time the building was built. That's a mandatory, that's a disclosure you better make, or that could come back and haunt you for sure. So what kind of stuff might require a permit? Well, almost anything, to be honest with you. If you wanted to replace your deck on the back of your house, for example, would that require a permit? I will tell you there are some specifications and variables on whether or not it would require a permit, but I will tell you that varies a lot from municipality to municipality. So it's always a good idea to just check with the building department and just say, hey, look, I'm thinking about adding a deck. They'll probably ask you, how big is it? How high is it off the ground, which is a major deal. And if it meets certain criteria, then it might require a permit. But in other cases, they might say, no, based on what you're saying or describing, it would not require a permit. But it's always better to be safe than sorry, for sure. All right, so some other things the permit would satisfy or do for us. We make sure the building is structurally sound, it's fire resistant, designed with proper egress, meaning we can get out if we need to, safe to use, those kind of things. That's a big deal. So permits, you gotta start, that should be always on your mind when you're getting ready to list a property for sale. Looking for stuff. You see people that have maybe enclosed their garage and turned it into living space. Well, you need to ask the question, did you get a permit for that? Because I'm telling you, that would require a permit. And then take it, just use that information based on what we've already talked about. But, you should always be asking that question. Did you get a permit? Did you get a permit? You can be asking that over and over again. I'm telling you, if you become one of these agents that just want to play dumb, act like you didn't know, not going to ask the questions, I'm telling you, this is going to come back and haunt you. I promise you it will. Excuse me. All right. And then this slide here just shows some other information about the permit. Again, you go to your local government agency. Typically it's a building department there in your municipality. They'll review your application, and as long as there's nothing, again, regulation or ordinance that would say you're not allowed to have it, they'll issue the permit. Okay. All right, let's move on to something else. Subdivision regulations, that's another form of police power. But HOAs, if you have a mandatory homeowners association, they've been granted police power by the state to enforce the covenants and restrictions within that HOA. And they can take any action they deem necessary to enforce it. They could fine you. At the end of the day, could they potentially even take the property from or have you evicted from the property? Yes. y'all, they can do that. Y'all, if you're not going to comply with the homeowner regulations, y'all, they can certainly kick you out of there. Y'all, that's police power, and they have the authority to do just that if it's going to come to that. But that's another example of a public control. Another example of a public control is health and sanitation laws. Yeah, if you go to a restaurant to eat out, wouldn't you like to think that those that are preparing and handling the food you're getting ready to eat has washed their hands, are clean, the workstation is clean, the floors are clean, and so we have laws to make sure that all these things are taken care of. There are health and sanitation requirements that must be adhered to. Thank goodness, for sure. Still dealing with these health and sanitation laws, obviously there's hazards that could pose threats to people, and we have to remove those hazards. Contamination, obviously that's a hazardous environment there. But a couple of terms there you see there at the bottom of this slide, might want to know what that is. They could ask you what is a superfund or what is abatement. Superfund is used to clean up hazardous websites. So, if you're doing some type of development or construction that could have a negative impact on the environment, for example, you'd probably have to pay some sum of money that will go into what they call a superfund. And that money will be used to clean up hazardous waste sites. Okay, that's what superfunds will do. And then you see abatement. Abatement just means it's the act of eliminating. To minimize, to reduce, if you will. And obviously, anytime we can eliminate or minimize negative impact on health and sanitation or environmental laws or any of that kind of stuff, that's what we want to do. But speaking of environmental laws, we do have plenty of them. And I'm sure you know as well as I do, the environment is a big deal today, right? Not going to get into the politics of it, but apparently the environment is a big deal. So we got to protect our air quality, water quality, soil quality. And so how do we do that? Well, if you're a developer and you're going to want to you're buying several acres of land that you're going to develop and build houses on, it might require you to cut down a bunch of trees, clear the land, and all that kind of stuff. Well, before you're going to be allowed to do that, there has to be what we call an environmental impact report. Now, you'll probably see this on the test as well. So the government basically will come out and assess what would the impact be based on the project you're proposing to do here. And what you're doing, would that have a negative impact on the environment? And if the report comes back saying that it could have a negative impact, then we will have to try to figure out ways to minimize or abate what that impact would be. But then we also want to mitigate. You see the term there, mitigation. That's the process to make issues less severe through avoiding, rectifying, or compensation. I find it interesting that compensation somehow mitigates the issue. It doesn't really mitigate the issue. The impact is still there, but through this compensation or fee you would have to pay, which would go into that super fund we were talking about. If there is an environmental issue, then that money would be used to clean up and do whatever they need to do. But this environmental impact report, that's a document that you would have to have before you can start clearing land and doing much to the property. Because again, we want to protect the environment. We don't want to do anything that would cause a problem there. Now, everything we've talked about up to this point, y'all, again, concerning police power, we've talked about several different examples of police power. And all of these examples are considered public controls, y'all, meaning the government has put these controls in place. Y'all, that's what public controls are. The government put these policies in place. But y'all, there are a couple types of police power that are considered private controls. Y'all, private controls are things that we do to ourselves. Y'all, the government didn't impose this. We imposed it on ourselves. Now, there's only 2 private controls. There were several public controls. But y'all, I will tell you, there's a good chance they could ask you a question like, which of the following forms of police power would be considered a public control or a private control? So you got to know the difference between public and private controls. Again, public is all government initiated. Private controls are things we do to ourselves. So what are those? Y'all, obviously deed restrictions. Deed restrictions are very common. A lot of people selling real estate, they will put restrictions in the deed saying, I'll sell it to you, but you must do this or you're not allowed to do that. Y'all, they'll have some conditions or restrictions on what you can and cannot do with the property. Y'all, just as a matter of review, if there are deed restrictions, what kind of estate are we talking about there? What kind of estate would that be? Y'all, and hopefully you said defeasible fee. Y'all, we just talked about that not too long ago. So just remember that. But y'all, again, the government didn't put that restriction there. That's something the homeowner at that time put there. So that's a private control. And then the last, or second and the last of the private controls are the CC&Rs. Y'all, these covenant conditions and restrictions. Y'all, again, this is stuff that you see with HOAs. Y'all, the homeowner association. Y'all, there are covenants and restrictions that you must comply with if you're going to purchase, own, or live in a home within this neighborhood. And again, y'all, these covenants and restrictions are not suggestions. You must comply with it, y'all, because again, the HOA has been granted police power by the state, and they can take whatever action they deem necessary to force you into compliance, whatever that would be. But again, the government didn't decide that you would have covenants and restrictions, and they certainly didn't decide what those restrictions would be. Y'all, these are things we as homeowners put on ourselves. So again, that's another example of a private control, again, based on police power. So, y'all, there's several examples of police power right there we've talked about, both public and private. Just make sure you know what they are and what's the difference between public and private controls.